The Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Ronald Lamola, is in the Eastern Cape to hold a gender-based violence Imbizo at Indwe in the Eastern Cape. The Imbizo is attended by the Department of Health and the SAPS to engage the community about the challenges they face when reporting cases. Dr. Lesley Ann Foster is the founder and executive director of non-governmental organization Masimanyane Women's Rights International, closely working with communities and victims of gender-based violence in the Eastern Cape. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, I've seen quite a number of reports about elderly people being violated. Just how big of a problem, particularly in the Eastern Cape, is this?
Well, we as Masimanyane Women's Rights International have been working in Butterworth, in King Williamstown, Lusikisiki and East London, the Greater East London area. And what we've seen in the rape statistics was that women in the age of 60 to 96 made up between 20 to 25% of rape victims that were reported to the Tutuzela centers. That's 20 to 25%, which is a very high number. Since then, we've seen a little bit of a decline with older women in some areas, but we have seen an increase in the number of boys and girls being raped at younger ages. But there's definitely a very serious problem around older women. When we visited Lusikisiki last year and into this year, most of the women in the villages that we were visiting said that they were very fearful of being able to go out at night. They didn't open their doors because they were always at risk of being raped. So there's a very serious issue around the rape of older women, and it's almost always by family members that they know. It's really from strangers, but actually people that they know. And also the justice for them is not equal and not accessible in the way that it is for other women. So we're seeing most of those rapes happening in rural communities. And that's a big challenge because the resources there are not very well distributed.
Well, gender-based violence is so broad. I mean, you just mentioned rape. There's femicide. There's the murder of women and young girls. There's the physical abuse of women and young girls. And South African institutions of higher learning and training in particular are experiencing an increase, in the prevalence of gender-based violence incidents committed against female students who are most often victims. So the cases of Uynene Mkhwetyana and Nosicelo Mtebeni who were murdered in the most diabolical manner is still pretty much fresh in our minds. So has a study been conducted then to investigate the prevalence and the underlying factors to gender-based violence amongst the female students in public universities, especially in the Eastern Cape?
There have been studies, and the presidency has called for a study on femicide in the country as a whole. And the first part of that study is complete to give us a much stronger picture. I think what you write about is that violence against women in all its forms are increasing in the country rather than decreasing. And a lot of that has got to do with the prevention strategies that have mainly been around awareness raising, and campaigns of such. What really needs to happen and is happening now because of our National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence is actually going deeper and looking at how we change social norms that give women greater status, that recognizes the contribution they make and the value that they have in our society. It's a long, hard slog to get to change mindsets, to get to change attitudes and behaviors. But what we're seeing is a surge of that happening now in our schools, in our tertiary institutions, and across our communities. So it's not going to be a quick fix, but it is definitely a step in the right direction. What we failed to do before was to understand how deep the drivers of gender-based violence go, and to see it as the changing of attitudes and behaviors and the norms and standards within our societies. But we must remember that we have very strong patriarchal institutions. Our religious institutions, our traditional cultural institutions across all communities are based on patriarchy. And to dismantle that is an enormous task which will take a lot of time and a lot of resources. We started the process. The results will be some time before we see a decline in that. I think we also cannot exclude from this the question of poverty and inequality, unemployment, and low employment for women and the dependence on males. So all of this, it's a big a bucket full of drivers that leads to the problems that we have in high levels of violence against women. But mainly now, how we deal with toxic masculinity from young age to older children, and then to men and young men and older men, that's a big challenge that we are going to be facing, that we are facing.
I quite agree with you, Dr. Foster, when you mention that gender-based violence is violence directed against any person based on gender norms. So would you then agree with me if I were to put it to you that certain cultural nuances add fuel to the fire in terms of gender-based violence? I mean, you mentioned patriarchy, you mentioned toxic masculinity, and in some instances, in some cultural settings, the issue of tolerating physical abuse, ostensibly to keep the home strong, ostensibly staying in that particular abusive relationship for the sake of the kids. Does that not fuel the scourge of gender-based violence?
It absolutely does, and I would like to say that it's across all communities. It's not an issue that one or a few cultural groups are actually facing. The truth is that all cultural groups, all racial groups, across even at people with access to resources are subjected to this. The problem is that we are socialized into women having to absorb the violence, and it's become normalized in our society to do that, and there's a lot of silence around that. So a little later on this evening, I'm going to be talking at the men's spiritual gathering about this and saying, what are the things that we need to do? And I think some of the things that we need to do is to increase male participation in the raising of children. We still see that it's a woman's issue, and yet men do not bond adequately enough with their children. So that's one of the things we need to do. We need to create safe spaces within our homes for people to talk about the violence that's happening to us. We continue to have women who were in their 40s and 50s will now, for the first time, reveal that they were raped as children. So that silence must be taken away. And in cases where the women have reported it as children, they've been told that it's a lie, that the son or the cousin or whatever would not have done that. So there's a lot of silencing in the family around violence, and that in part becomes a societal issue. So we need to deal with those barriers, those challenges that girls face and women face when they do suffer violence. So, we talk about breaking the silence, but I don't think we've really looked into why that silence is there, and that we need to stop that. And with femicide, women will keep quiet about abuse and eventually lose their lives to it. And the intricate linkage of, what will start off as a loud voice, a loud shout at a woman, escalate into a slap, can very more often than not these days in femicide, with the woman losing her life. So we have to look at that continuum of violence from childhood to eldership. And as I said, the oldest woman that we've seen who's been raped is 96 years old, by a family member. All of that whole continuum has to be looked at and has to be reversed for us to see any kind of change.
All right, Dr. Foster, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your thoughts.